Look at the map of the ancient world. Most of it is stained with a single color. The color of Rome. For 3 centuries, that color expanded like an ink blot on parchment, swallowing kingdoms, erasing tribes, turning kings into servants and queens into property. The empire did not negotiate with rivals, it deleted them. The rules were written in iron, and the most important rule was absolute: if you challenge the capital, you die in the dark. But then came the year AD 272. At the easternmost fringe of the world, where the red dirt of the Syrian desert falls into the grey waters of the Euphrates, the ink ran out. A single woman stood at the river's edge. She had stolen a third of the empire's land. She had choked its throat. She had made the Caesars look small. This is not a textbook history of dates and treaties. This is the anatomy of a gamble. A story about the cold geometry of power, the smell of burning horses under a desert sun, and the terrifying realization that sometimes, the worst thing an enemy can do to you is let you live. The water was right there. If you stand on the western bank of the Euphrates River, you can see the other side. It looks close. It looks like safety. In the spring of AD 272, the other side of that river was not just land. It was Persia. It was the Sasanian Empire. It was the only power on the planet big enough to look at Rome and not blink. For a woman fleeing through the dust, that water was the border between a crown and a rope. She had been riding for days. Her thighs were raw from the camel's hide. Her throat felt like sand. Behind her, 300 miles away, her city was burning. Palmyra. The jewel of the desert. The city where she had worn the purple. Now, the city was surrounded by the legions of an emperor who did not believe in mercy. She had slipped through the Roman siege lines at night. It was a miracle she had made it this far. The desert was her backyard. She knew every dry well, every hidden ravine, every shifting dune. The Romans were heavy, clumsy, and blinded by their own armor. She had outrun them. She had beaten the perimeter. For 48 hours, she was not a target. She was a queen on the wind. Now, she was at the bank. The river was wide here, swollen with the spring melt from the northern mountains. The current was mud-brown and fast. She needed a boat. She needed a raft. She needed 5 more minutes. She did not get them. The sound came first. It was not the sound of thunder. It was the sound of iron sliding against leather, the rhythmic, heavy thud of horses trained to gallop in formation. The Roman cavalry does not ride like the nomads. They do not scatter. They move like a wall. A wall of meat and steel. They came out from the low hills behind the river bank. Not 2. Not 10. A full contingent. Their horses were dripping with sweat, their nostrils flared, their eyes wide with the strain of a 3-day hunt. They did not shout. They did not call for her surrender. They simply rode in a crescent moon shape, their flanks widening, their center closing. They closed the last gap behind her. The horsemen ran her down at the river's edge. Consider the stillness of that moment. The camel stops. The animal is tired, its knees buckle into the soft mud of the bank. The water is still moving in front of her. It is close enough to splash against her boots if she steps forward. The air carries the smell of wet earth and horse sweat. And then, the noise of the desert drops away, replaced by the heavy, cold sound of iron. The chains go on her wrists. They are not decorative. They are old, heavy links, pitted with rust from some legionary warehouse in Antioch. They are cold against her skin, which is still burning from the desert sun. When the iron clicks shut, the war is over. The rebellion that had paralyzed the Mediterranean for 3 years is reduced to the sound of 2 metal loops meeting around a woman's bones. She lost it at the river. Her name is Zenobia. 18 months earlier, that name was a terror in the mouth of every senator in Rome. 18 months earlier, her commands changed the price of bread in Italy. She did not just rule a city, she ruled an empire within an empire. Her territory went from the black soil of the Nile Delta to the high, cold plateaus of Anatolia. The Mediterranean was her lake. She had looked at her son, a child named Vabilathus, and she had done the unthinkable. She had clothed him in the imperial robes. She had given him the title of Augustus. In the ancient world, you did not do that unless you were ready to clear the graveyard. It was an eviction notice served to Rome. She called herself the equal of the Caesars. And for a short, beautiful season, the map agreed with her. Now, the map was being redrawn by a man with a sword. She is a prisoner of a contingent of cavalry. The men who hold the ropes are non-citizens, auxiliaries from the European frontiers, men who don't care about her lineage or her philosophy. To them, she is a prize. A very high-value piece of meat that must be delivered to the emperor alive and unbroken. Because the empire she challenged has a rule for women like her. The rule is not written in the law books. It is written in the soil of the forum. The rule is old, and the rule is simple. Every rebel who threatened Rome on this scale died. They did not get comfortable retirements. They did not get trials with lawyers. They were brought to the Capitol. They were forced to walk through the dirt while the plebeians threw rotten fruit and stones at their heads. And then, when the parade was finished, they were taken down into the dark. The place was called the Tullianum. The Mamertine prison. A hole in the rock beneath the city, where the air was thick with the smell of old blood and rot. There, in the dark, while the crowd above was still cheering for the victory, a man with a thick rope would step out of the shadows. A quick twist of the cord around the neck. A short struggle. A silence. That was the script. Jugurtha died that way. Vercingetorix died that way. Every king who thought he could defy the Senate ended up as a blue corpse in a Roman ditch. The example was the point. The empire survived because it was a machine that turned rebels into warnings. Zenobia knew the script. She had studied Roman history. She spoke their language. As she sat on the muddy bank of the Euphrates, watching the current move toward the sea, she would have been calculating the distance between this river and that hole in the ground. But Zenobia was wrong about the ending. The emperor who caught her was not a normal man. He was a hard soldier named Aurelian, a man born in the stables of the Balkans who had fought his way to the top of the world. He was a man of iron rules. And yet, he looked at the queen from Palmyra, and he broke the empire's oldest rule about rebels. He kept her alive. This is the story of how one provincial queen forced Rome's most disciplined soldier to bend the metal of his own system. It is a story about what that exception cost her, and what it cost the world she left behind. Because in the game of empires, survival is never free. Sometimes, the life they give you is heavier than the rope they spare you from. Why did Aurelian break his own absolute law for Zenobia? A. Out of love. B. To avoid riots. C. As a trophy. D. Fearing her gods. Stay with us till the end for valuable insights. Like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. To understand how a woman ended up in iron links at the edge of the Euphrates, you have to look at a map, and then you have to look at a grain silo. 3 years before the cavalry caught her, Zenobia was not a prisoner. She was the most dangerous person in the Roman world. Her home was Palmyra, a city that should not have existed. It was a caravan city, an oasis of stone and green palms dropped right into the middle of the Syrian desert. It sat exactly where the trade roads from the silk markets of the east met the ports of the west. If you wanted luxury, if you wanted purple dye, Indian spices, Chinese silk, or Persian jade, your camels had to pass through Palmyra. And Palmyra took its cut. The trade made the city immensely rich. It was a place of marble columns in the middle of sand dunes, where the merchants wore gold rings and built tombs that looked like palaces. On paper, it was a Roman possession. In reality, it was a state within a state. Zenobia's husband, a man named Odaenathus, had been Rome's strongman in that part of the world. He was the man who held the line. During the middle of the 3rd century, Rome's central government was not an empire, it was a slaughterhouse. For 30 years, emperors were murdered by their own troops almost every 6 months. The borders were collapsing. The Persians had actually captured a Roman emperor alive and used him as a footstool. In that chaos, Odaenathus did what the Caesars could not. He raised a Palmyrene army, beat the Persians back, and secured the east. Rome was too weak to stop him, so they gave him titles. They called him the governor of the east. They made him a partner in power because they had no choice. Then, around the year AD 267, Odaenathus and his eldest son were assassinated. The details are oily, suspicious, and lost to time. Some said it was a family feud, others whispered that Rome had ordered the hit because the strongman was getting too strong. Zenobia did not cry, she stepped into the empty space. Her son, Babylathus, was just a small child. She became his regent. For a short while, she governed the way Rome expected a widow to govern, holding the seat warm for a boy, sending polite letters to the Senate, pretending to be a loyal servant of the capital. Then, she stopped pretending. In or around the year AD 270, a Palmyrene army did something impossible. It did not march east to fight Persians. It marched west, out of the desert, and straight into Egypt. Her general, a brutal and effective strategist named Zabdas, led the vanguard. The Roman prefect who tried to hold the province, Tenagino Probus, fought like a dog, but his legions were broken. He was defeated, captured, and executed. And in Alexandria, the great Mediterranean port that fed the city of Rome itself, the harbor went completely quiet. Consider what that silence meant. Alexandria was not just another city. It was the heart of the imperial stomach. The city of Rome had a population of over 1 million people, and most of them were poor. They did not grow food, they lived on the koura anoni, the grain dole. Every single day, hundreds of thousands of Roman mouths were fed by wheat grown in the thick, black mud of the Nile Delta. The logistics were massive. The heat came off the Nile Delta in waves, and the air in the Alexandria harbor district carried the heavy, sweet, slightly dusty smell of the grain warehouses. Thousands of tons of wheat were waiting on the docks. Under normal circumstances, the harbor would be a screaming chaos of sailors, dockworkers, and captains. The great grain fleet, hundreds of massive wooden ships, would be loading up, preparing to sail west across the sea to Italy. Now, the ships stayed tied up at their moorings. They bobbed gently in the water. The sails were furled. The crews sat on the wood and waited. The harbor went dead because the woman who now controlled the docks had not given them leave to sail. Think about the leverage. Taking Egypt was not just expanding a kingdom, it was not a border dispute over some square miles of sand. Egypt was Rome's bread. To hold Alexandria was to put a cold hand around the throat of the capital and feel the pulse there. Zenobia had her fingers on the windpipe of the civilized world. If she squeezed, the city of Rome would riot within a month. Starvation would turn the capital into a civil war zone. Somewhere east of that harbor, back in her palace at Palmyra, Zenobia received the news that Egypt was hers. The reports would have been delivered by messengers covered in sea salt and dust. She would have read the parchment, looked out over her own marble city, and understood exactly what she had just done. There was no walking this back. A regent who seizes the imperial grain supply has not made a bold move in a negotiation. She has not asked for a better deal. She has made herself completely, utterly unforgivable. The cold thrill of that realization would have come with a much colder thing underneath it, the understanding that every road from this moment on ran toward a Roman army. She had crossed the line between a provincial ruler and an existential threat. Rome could tolerate a lot of things. It could tolerate dead governors, lost coins, and stolen provinces, but it could never tolerate a hungry capital. She gave the order anyway. Keep the ships tied up. Keep the grain in the warehouses. Let them wait. For about a year, Rome did almost nothing. The capital stayed silent. There were no immediate fleets sent, no massive armies landing on her coast. Zenobia read that silence as permission. She looked at the quiet sea and thought the empire was too broken, too exhausted from its own internal wars to fight back. It was not permission. It was an emperor finishing other wars first. His name was Aurelian. He was currently in the north, clearing the barbarian tribes out of Italy and rebuilding the walls of Rome itself. He was not ignoring her, he was simply clearing his hands so he could use both of them to crush her. The problem with a heavy sword is that it takes a long time to swing. The problem with light cavalry is that they know exactly when to jump out of the way. By the late months of AD 271, the silence ended. Aurelian had cleared his hands. He turned his eyes east, and when an emperor like Aurelian turned his eyes, 40,000 men moved with them. He did not send letters. He did not send negotiators. He crossed the Hellespont into Anatolia with the speed of a fire in a dry field. One of his naval commanders smashed into Egypt, broke the Palmyrene garrison there, and forced the grain gates open. The silence in the harbor of Alexandria was replaced by the creak of wooden hulls sailing west again. Rome's throat was free. Now, Aurelian was coming for the hands that had squeezed it. Zenobia did not flinch. She had a general she trusted, Zabdas, and she had the most feared military unit in the ancient world, the cataphracts. Consider the physical reality of a Palmyrene cataphract. This was not the light, fast cavalry of the desert tribes. This was a human tank. Both horse and rider were encased in iron and bronze scales from head to hoof. The men wore heavy helmets that covered their faces completely, leaving only small slits for the eyes. Their weapon was the contus, a massive 12-foot pike that could impale 2 men at once. In a straight, frontal charge across flat ground, there was nothing in the Roman manual that could stop them. They didn't just break infantry lines, they rode through them like a boot through wheat. Aurelian met this army in the field near Antioch, at a place called Imi. The ground was flat, hard, and dusty, perfect for a cavalry charge. Zabdas looked at the field, looked at his iron horses, and ordered the attack. The ground shook. Thousands of tons of armored meat and steel accelerated into a gallop. The noise would have been deafening, the rhythmic clattering of metal scales, the snorting of horses, the roar of the sand rising behind them in a yellow wall. Aurelian did not form his legions into a defensive square. He did not try to meet the iron wall with his own shields. Instead, he deployed his light cavalry, men from Dalmatia and Mauritania, riding small, fast horses with no armor at all. And then, he gave an order that looked like absolute cowardice. He told them to run away. As soon as the Palmyrene cataphracts reached charging distance, the Roman line did not stand. It dissolved. The light horsemen turned their mounts around and fled into the desert. The cataphracts did exactly what heavy cavalry always does when they see an enemy's back: they gave chase. They smelled a rout. They pushed their horses faster, their heavy pikes leveled, chasing the dust cloud ahead of them. And that was where the trap clicked shut. Aurelian had not panicked. He had done the arithmetic of the sun. It was midsummer in Syria. The temperature on that plain would have been well over 40 degrees Celsius. Inside those suits of iron scales, the Palmyrene riders were sitting in personal ovens. The metal absorbed the sun until it was hot enough to blister skin. The horses, carrying the weight of an armored man plus their own bronze plates, were working twice as hard as any wild animal. They ran for miles. The fast, light Roman cavalry kept just out of reach, turning back occasionally to throw a javelin before sprinting away again. The chase went from a sprint to a trot, and from a trot to a heavy, stumbling walk. The Syrian sun did Aurelian's work for him. Inside that armor, men were cooking in their own sweat. The horses' lungs were burning, their tongues hung out, thick with grey foam and desert dust. When the Palmyrene charge had completely spent itself, when the horses were shaking with exhaustion and the riders could barely lift their arms inside their iron sleeves, Aurelian gave his real signal. The light cavalry stopped running. They turned around. And from the ridges on either side, the heavy Roman infantry appeared. They didn't target the riders, they targeted the horses. They drove short swords into the unprotected bellies of the animals. When a cataphract fell, the weight of his own armor pinned him to the dirt like a turtle on its back. He could not stand up. He could only watch as the Roman clubs and axes came down on his iron mask. It was not a battle, it was a slaughter. Zabdos gathered what little he had left and pulled back toward the city of Emesa. Zenobia was waiting there with her treasury. She had the gold of the East, but gold cannot replace a dead army. Aurelian followed them with the steady, unblinking pace of a machine. At Emesa, they tried again. The same field, the same heavy cavalry, the same feigned retreat. It is almost impossible to believe that Zabdos fell for the same trick twice, but history is full of men who believe their own myth until the ground drinks their blood. The second battle was identical to the first, only bloodier. When the dust settled at Emesa, Zenobia's treasury was gone. Her elite army was dead in the sand. The road to Palmyra was open, and the only thing left between her and the emperor was the stone wall of her own city. She retreated inside Palmyra. She closed the heavy iron gates. Aurelian followed her across the dry plains, surrounded the oasis, and put the jewel of the desert under siege. A stone wall is not a defense, it is just a clock. It tells you exactly how many days of wheat you have left before you start looking at your neighbor's dog with a knife. Inside the walls of Palmyra, the clock was ticking loud. The sun rose and fell over the white marble columns, but the market stalls were empty. The water in the oasis was still sweet, but the grain bins were thinning out. Aurelian's siege lines were a second wall, made of dirt, wood, and iron spears, wrapped tightly around the city. No Roman offer of mercy came through the gates. Aurelian was not interested in a surrender that left Zenobia with her pride. He wanted the keys to the east, and he wanted her in chains. So, Zenobia made a decision that tells you everything about what kind of ruler she was. She was not a tragic queen who would sit on a gold throne and wait for the battering rams to break her palace doors. She was a gambler. If the city was going to die, she would not die with it. She would ride for Persia herself. She went out through the siege lines at night. Consider the nerve that requires. She did not take a carriage, she did not take an escort of guards. She chose a single camel, a fast, lean animal trained for the long-distance trade routes. She dressed like a nomad, wrapping her face in dark cloth to hide her skin and her teeth from the light of the watchfires. The desert was her country. She had been born to read its floors better than any Roman soldier in that camp. To an Italian legionary, the desert at night was a terrifying sheet of nothing, full of ghosts and sandstorms. To Zenobia, it was a map of paths, dips, and shadows. She slipped past the Roman sentries in the dark. Consider the few hours that followed. The desert night is not warm, it is a cold, dry weight that settles over the skin. The wind off the dunes carries a fine, sharp grit that finds its way into the corners of your eyes and the back of your throat until every swallow tastes like dirt. There is almost no sound out there. The silence of the deep desert is heavy enough to make your ears ring. There was only the wet, rhythmic breathing of the animal under her and the soft, flat thud of its wide feet sinking into the cold sand. Behind her, getting smaller with every mile, were the fires of the Roman camp. A thin line of orange sparks dancing on the horizon. That line was the empire she had challenged. She was gambling that she could outrun its reach. And inside her, as she looked at the black spaces ahead, there would have been a particular kind of dread, the dread of a woman who had never once in her entire life been powerless. For 3 years, her word had been law from Alexandria to Ankara. If she spoke, men died. If she gestured, fleets stayed at the docks. Now, everything she was, everything she had built, and the survival of her entire city was being measured against two things, the speed of a single camel and the width of a distant river. She was doing the arithmetic in the dark. The arithmetic was bad. The Euphrates was 300 miles away. A camel can travel fast, but it cannot travel forever without water, and Aurelian scouts were not stupid. They would find the tracks in the morning. They would see the single stride of a racing mount heading straight for the Persian border. She cleared the siege lines anyway. For a few hours, the gamble was alive. She was free. The wind was in her face, and the purple robes she had left behind in the palace didn't matter. This was the last stretch of Zenobia's life in which she was still a queen and not a piece of imperial property. Everything after the Euphrates is just the aftermath of a broken bet. She didn't make the crossing. The horseman ran her down right where the sand met the mud of the bank, while the water she needed to save her life was still moving in front of her, close enough to see, close enough to smell. And here, the story that Rome handed down to us begins to come apart. Because what happened next survives only in versions, and the versions cannot all be true. After her capture at the river, Aurelian did not take her straight to Italy. He dragged her and her son to Emesa, the city where her army had been slaughtered, to stand trial before a military court. Along with her went the leading figures of the Palmyrene court, including the celebrated Greek philosopher and rhetorician Longinus, who had been her chief advisor. The Roman accounts that come down to us, the Historia Augusta and the historian Zosimus, say that at that trial, Zenobia broke. They want us to believe that the proud queen of the desert became a weeping woman who blamed everyone else to save her own neck. They say she threw her own counselors to the wolves, pointing her finger at Longinus and claiming he was the one who wrote the letters defying Rome, while she was just an innocent woman misled by clever men. Longinus was executed by the Romans because of that accusation. That is the story Rome preserved in its libraries. But you have to look at who wrote the books. There is no contemporary account of that trial. Not one. Every version we have was written decades later by Roman men for Roman audiences. And a cowardly Zenobia, a queen who betrayed her friends the moment she was cornered, was extraordinarily convenient for the man who caught her. A traitorous, weeping queen gave the conquered Palmyrenes no hero to gather around. It turned her from a legendary warrior into an embarrassing coward. The cowardice may be real, fear does strange things to the strongest minds. But it may also be propaganda doing its job in the dark, and after 17 centuries, we have no way to separate the blood from the ink. This is the deeper problem with Zenobia. The woman who ruled a third of the Roman world survives almost entirely in the words of the men who beat her. We do not have her diary. We do not have her letters to her generals. We have Rome's edit of her voice. Even her most famous claim, that she was descended from Cleopatra, the last queen of Egypt, comes to us through that same twisted lens. Though that claim does seem to have been genuinely hers, an official declaration issued in her son's name called Alexandria her ancestral city. She was telling the Mediterranean that she was Cleopatra's heir, that she was completing a story that had been interrupted 3 centuries earlier by Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. Whether the bloodline was real almost does not matter, the claim was a weapon, and she chose to wield it with maximum precision. And there is physical proof of how carefully she played the longer game, proof that outlived every piece of paper. Before the open break with the capital, coins were struck in the mints of Antioch and Alexandria showing 2 faces together, her young son Vaballathus and the Emperor Aurelian side by side. Consider those coins. They are a queen negotiating her son's legitimacy in metal, using the Roman system against itself, testing how much the system would tolerate before she stepped outside it entirely. When she finally did step outside, the coins changed. Aurelian's face was dropped. Vaballathus was proclaimed Augustus, a full emperor, Rome's equal, and Rome's rival. The metal marks the exact moment the negotiation ended and the war began. So, the question this leaves is the question the rest of her life answers: did Aurelian decide to spare her because he was a man of peace, or did Zenobia make herself impossible to kill? The answer was delivered in Rome in the summer of AD 274, in front of the entire population of the capital. The year is AD 274. The triumph of Aurelian moves through the streets of Rome toward the Capitoline Hill. A Roman triumph was not just a parade, it was a religious ritual and a massive political statement. The streets were packed with hundreds of thousands of citizens, screaming, drinking wine, and waiting for the show. And walking in that dirt, on foot ahead of the emperor's grand chariot, was Zenobia. Not riding in a carriage. Not carried on a litter. Walking the way a hunting trophy is walked. According to the Historia Augusta, she was loaded with gold, chains of it, heavy jewels, massive ornaments, so much weight of precious metal that she could barely move under it. Her knees buckled under the literal wealth of her own defeat, and Roman guards had to walk beside her, holding the heavy gold links up so she could keep moving forward through the mud. Around her, the roar of the Roman crowd would have been like a physical wall of sound. Above her, the hot Mediterranean sun beat down full on a desert queen who had been turned into a live museum exhibit. On her wrists were gold bands, the exact same wrists that 2 years earlier had signed orders to mobilize armies and starve Italy. And the crowd knew the script. Every citizen in that street knew how a triumph was supposed to end. The captured enemy was displayed, walked the length of the city so the people could see the scale of what their emperor had conquered, and then they were taken aside. While the emperor ascended the temple steps, the prisoners were led down into the Tullianum and choked to death with a cord. That was the ending. Vercingetorix died that way after Julius Caesar's triumph. Jugurtha died that way after the triumph of Marius. The walk through the city was not the punishment, the walk was the prelude to the execution. Follow the route as she walked it. She is a queen who has been converted into an object, weighed down with the engineered, glittering proof of her own failure. She is moving toward the Capitoline Hill, knowing what waits at the base of that rock. She has watched Rome do this before. She knows the cell at the end of the line is where people like her stop existing. The real stake that afternoon was not the heavy gold, and it was not the shouting crowd. It was the not knowing. She walks the entire length of the grand city believing each step is a step toward a dark room and a rope. She has to keep her chin up under the weight of the metal, in front of all of them, waiting for the blow. And then, Aurelian does not kill her. He walks her the entire length of Rome, and at the end of the road, he suspends the empire's oldest rule about rebels in the open, in front of the entire population that had come specifically to watch him honor it. He spared her life, and he spared the life of Tetricus, a Western rebel ruler captured in the same wars. The mercy was not an impulse of kindness. It was a cold, calculated strategy. And Zenobia was its centerpiece. The chains came off. And what Rome did with Zenobia after the triumph is stranger than what it did to her during it. The dominant tradition holds that Aurelian gave her a villa at Tibur, the town we now call Tivoli, located in the fashionable green hills outside Rome. This was the same district where the Emperor Hadrian had built his enormous villa generations before. It was a place of olive groves, cool fountains, and quiet stone terraces. She was not erased, she was settled. It was the same clemency that Aurelian had shown Tetricus, the Western rebel. But by the time she lived there, something had already happened that the quiet of the Italian hills could not soften. While Zenobia was being moved toward Rome, Palmyra had revolted a second time. The city rose up and killed the Roman garrison Aurelian had left inside, 600 archers and his appointed governor. When the news reached the emperor, he turned his army around and went back to the desert. This time, there was no clemency at all. He destroyed the city, the walls, the temples, the streets, the people. Palmyra, the city Zenobia had ruled, the city she had ridden out of in the dark on a camel to try to save, was a field of ruins a full year before she ever reached her villa in Italy. So she is there in the garden, living with that knowledge. There is bird song. There is still the warm Italian air, the cool of stone in the shade, and the ordinary quiet of an afternoon in the hills outside Rome. And inside that quiet is the understanding that the empire whose garden she is sitting in is the same empire that wiped her city off the earth. This is the asymmetry at the center of her survival. Aurelian's mercy was only ever for Zenobia, it was never for the place. The woman was spared, and the city was annihilated. Both of those decisions came from the same hand in the same war. She survived, and the price of understanding her own survival was holding it in the same body as Palmyra's destruction, in the same quiet room, for the rest of her life. She got the gentler mercy and the harder knowledge at once. What came after for her was a Roman life, though the details blur. Later writers claimed she remarried a Roman senator and that her daughters married into noble Roman families, though modern historians treat the remarriage as a thin-laid embellishment, probably grown out of the better attested fact that her descendants did survive in Rome. Vabalethus, the son in whose name she had ruled an empire, simply disappears from the record after the defeat. He may have died on the voyage west, or he may have been quietly executed because he was male and had been proclaimed an emperor, a combination too dangerous for Rome to leave alone. The record does not say, it just stops. And here is the trade laid out plain. Aurelian got both halves of what he wanted. He got the image of a conquered queen walked through his capital in gold, and he got a reputation for mercy that cost him nothing he valued. Zenobia got her life. Both of them paid for the arrangement. She paid with her crown, with her city, and with her son's line. He paid by breaking a rule of the empire that he could never afterward unbreak. And that hill town is where the trail goes physical, because Zenobia did not vanish into legend. She left a bloodline, and it can be traced in stone. In the Syrian desert, inscriptions still stand that name Zenobia and her son Vabalethus, cut in the Aramaic script of her own city. Those are her monuments, the version of herself that she authored in stone before Rome ever wrote its version of her. They are the queen in her own words. And then there is the other end of the trail in Italy. A Roman inscription survives carrying the names of her family line, the name Septimia, the dynastic line of her husband Odaenathus, names that belonged to her household. The 4th century Roman historian Eutropius wrote plainly that the descendants of Zenobia were still living as Roman nobility in his own time, a full century after she walked through Rome in chains. Jerome records the same thing. Set the two places side by side, the desert ruins of Palmyra and the green hills of Tivoli. Both still exist. Both can still be visited. The stones in Syria say she was a queen. The stones and the records in Italy say her blood became Roman, settled, ordinary, absorbed. Both are true at the same time, and the contradiction between them is the whole story. Because here is the quiet, unsettling thing underneath all of it, the single most successful thing Zenobia ever did was survive. And she survived in a way that made her disappear. Her descendants carried her name and lived. Roman lives in a Roman city. The empire she had tried to break did not destroy her family, it became the thing her family was. Which leaves one last question, the one the gold chains were always really about. Go back to that image of the triumph one more time, the queen weighed down with more gold than she could carry. Ask what the gold was actually for. It was not decoration, it was an argument. Rome needed Zenobia visibly defeated and visibly alive in the same moment because a dead Zenobia was a martyr the Palmyrines could rally to, and a free Zenobia was a threat that could ride east again. But a Zenobia turned into a wealthy Roman matron in a hillside villa was something better than either. She was proof. Proof that the empire could conquer anything, even a will as hard as hers, and not just conquer it, but absorb it, dress it in gold, and retire it to the hills. And even now, we cannot tell you for certain how she died. Zosimus says she never reached Rome at all, that illness or self-starvation took her on the road. Another chronicler, John Malalas, says she was beheaded after the triumph. The dominant tradition says she lived out a long and quiet life at Tibur. 3 endings. They cannot all be true, and Rome left us no way to choose between them. So we close where the evidence still stands. Not in a chronicle, not in a contested account written by men who never met her, but in stone in the 2 places her life actually touched the earth. In the Syrian desert, the city of Palmyra still holds her inscriptions in the sand, her own name cut in her own script, in the Aramaic of the city she ruled. Stand in front of one of those inscriptions and you are reading the version of Zenobia that existed before Rome got to write its version, the queen in her own words, in her own hand, in the place she chose. And far to the west, the hills of Tivoli still hold the tradition of her, the green Italian district where the empire settled her when it was finished parading her. 2 ends of one life in 2 countries, separated by the whole width of the Mediterranean. And neither of them is the dark cell of the Tullianum where Rome's own oldest rule said a rebel queen was supposed to end. Hold that distance for a moment, because the distance is the verdict. Every rebel who came before her on this scale died at the close of the triumph, in the dark, by the cord. That was the ending Rome wrote again and again because the ending was the lesson. Zenobia got a different one. She got a garden. She got hills. She got a long quiet that the strangled men before her were never given. And the strangeness of that is not softened by time, it sharpens. Rome did not forgive her. Rome did something more total than forgiveness. It took the most dangerous woman in its world, the queen who put her hand on its grain and called her son an emperor, and it did not break her in a cell. It absorbed her. It dressed her in gold, walked her through its streets, and then let her disappear into its own bloodline until she was indistinguishable from the thing she had tried to destroy. The chains were made of gold because Rome could not decide whether Zenobia was a prisoner or a possession. A prisoner you execute, a possession you keep. The gold was the empire arguing with itself in public, unable to land on which one she was. And in the end, it did not land on either. It made her neither prisoner nor possession. It made her a Roman. It folded her out into the senatorial families, into the inscriptions, into the descendants that walked the city 100 years later. And somewhere in that folding, the queen of Palmyra stopped being a queen at all. And then Rome lost track of how her story ended. It kept 3 endings and could not choose between them. The death on the road, the blade after the triumph, the long life in the hills, and it let all 3 stand. The empire that recorded everything, that carved its victories into arches and columns so they would outlast everyone who saw them, could not tell you for certain what became of the woman it beat. That was not an oversight. A martyr needs a death. A legend needs a death. By leaving her ending blurred, by letting her simply thin out into Roman nobility with no final scene, Rome denied her the one thing every rebel before her had been given without asking. It denied her a moment that history could point to and remember. Which may have been exactly the point. If you enjoy dark untold history, subscribe because we uncover what others won't.